Yeah, my name is Saeed Adesumbo Bello. Currently, my home university is the Vrije University of Amsterdam, where I work on my second PhD in African philosophy. My background is in theater art. I did my PhD in theater art at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, looking at the relationship between film and literature. Of course, my focus was on African philosophy, African literature, African film. And at the moment, I did my first PhD at the University of Lagos and my second PhD at the Vrije University of Amsterdam. My first PhD, like I said, is on film and literature. And I always focus on interdisciplinary research. That is why I look at the relationship between film and literature in my first PhD. Of course, I've done two postdoctoral fellowship in the past, which I also focus on the interdisciplinary studies, looking at the relationship between film and philosophy. Of course, my first postdoc was at the University of Beirut. The second one was at the University of London. And at the moment, I'm also doing another interdisciplinary studies, looking at how this project on apocalyptic regime and the death of indigenous pluribus can actually bridge the gap between history, philosophy, literary, and performance studies. At CAPAS, I'm currently working on a project on apocalyptic regime and the death of indigenous pluribus in the Niger Delta, using the work of Yerima, trilogies on the Niger Delta. The plays are Art Grant, Little Drops, and Ikpomo. Of course, I'm trying to address the questions of power in modern state biopolitics. And I'm looking at how Yerima has been able to dramatize the influence of the histories of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism on the modern African state, especially Nigeria, and how these has erased the indigenous words of the Niger Delta people. So of course my audience are post-colonial African people, or let me say post-colonial people all over the world, especially the people of the African origin in Africa and the African diaspora. Yes, I deployed Soyinka's the first stage to unpack Foucault's Biopolitics as a philosophical tool through which one can actually get to the root of the matter by explaining the historical process and political philosophy that shaped our post-colonial world. I think I'm interested in Yerima's trilogy because the play actually speaks to the problems of power, not only in Nigeria, but also in Africa. And of course, I'm particularly working on the drama because of its thematic content, historical and philosophical subtext that actually speaks to the problems of power as the problems of biopolitics in the modern Nigerian state. Yeah, I think Soyinka and Foucault has been able to speak to the problems of power in our contemporary social realities. And because of that, I think two of them are relevant to an intercultural interpretations of Yerima's play. Of course, for me, I can see the influence of Nietzsche on both Soyinka and Foucault. But my reading is new because no one has been able to establish the connection, the link between Soyinka and Foucault. And for me, I think we need to start giving intercultural interpretations to our modern drama so as to expose some of the problems that we are facing in this modern world. Yerima play has been able to dramatize the interconnected of social, spiritual, and natural world in the Niger Delta by referring us to the deep history of the Niger Delta people. And Yerima was able to do that by drawing historical materials from the ancient histories of the people, and also by comparing her, by playing this historical background against the modern state history, where there is a kind of contradiction or dichotomy between the spiritual world and the social world. And of course, today, we, as the audience of Yerima, we need to look at these two different worlds and see how we can rethink the interconnectedness of the spiritual, social, and the natural world, and how this way of thinking about this connectedness can actually help us to rethink our understandings of environmental humanities in the contemporary society. I think Yerima's trilogy has been able to expose the effect of the apocalyptic regime on the Niger Delta by referring us to how the history of colonialism has been able to stop the advancement of the people's technology, the advancement of the Niger Delta civilization, and of course the introduction or the impositions of the apocalyptic regime has also contributed to the problems of environmental degradation, environmental pollution, communal mistrust, or what Rob Nixon described as the slow violence in the Niger Delta. Of course, today, people of the Niger Delta can no longer use their water. They cannot use the water to bathe, to drink, and the kind of air they breathe is something that kills them slowly. And because of that, people are actually rethinking their way of life. They are thinking of, they are trying to compare their ancient world to the modern Nigerian society. I applied the notions of apocalypse and post-apocalypse in my research as ends and beginnings of the world in the history of humanity. By ends and beginnings, I mean the destructive moments of transition in the histories of humanity. Of course, I would actually recommend Burna Boy's Another Story. The song actually speaks to the problems of power in Nigeria, and in the music, Burna Boy tells all the stories of how the neo-colonial Nigerian government has been deceiving us, telling all sorts of lies since 1960. And of course, for me, one can actually look at the history or the origins of this apocalyptic regime beyond 1960. And that explains why in my work, I try to start the history from the 15th century, when the Niger Delta people first had an encounter with the European traders from England, from Portugal, and from the Netherlands. Thank you.